The office of the Belhar Uniting Reformed Church is certainly a very appropriate venue to discuss the new anthology we're releasing today. Tokkies, Reflections on Solidarity. Now, we must consider why this premises is so significant. The Belhar Confession, which was adopted by the Dutch Reformed Mission Church in 1986, was an instrumental historical confession. It illuminated the dichotomy of reconciliation and the justice of God. It presented the theme of unity as both a gift and an obligation of the Church. The confession itself was accepted and endorsed by delegates of the DRMC in a venue on this very premises. This landmark moment has its roots in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. It shaped the lives and careers of many theologians and the students of theology who passed through the doors of the Faculty of Religion at the University of the Western Cape. The Belhar Confession is also a common refrain in this anthology. It is a reflection on the life and times of the many people who continue to provide comfort, direction, and hope across many spheres of South African society. We're speaking today to Reverends Derrick and Mariette Franz. Both of them, as editorial committee members, have been absolutely instrumental in the formulation and work behind the delivery of this anthology. Derrick and Mariette, welcome to today's discussion and congratulations on an absolutely superb publication.
Thank you.
Can you tell me how you feel about the significance of this book? Mariette.
Thank you, Florence. How do I feel about it? Aesthetic, proud, very emotional, humbled. It was just such a journey for each and every one of us. I was a student in the 1990s, where a lot of things changed in South Africa, and I was part of that change. And being at the Faculty of Theology, a faculty that was part of the liberation, it was significant in many ways. So to pen that down and listen to all the stories and to be part of this publication, it's really something that I can say, well done.
Okay, and Derrick, how do you feel? You've come to the end of a long journey.
Thank you very much. This is very exciting. It's like Mariette says, it's a humbling experience, indeed a humbling experience. I think we discovered so many colleagues, a lot of things that we kind of lost, that was lost in time, was revived again. And so we were able to look at apartheid again. We were able to look at the role of churches again. We were able to look at different theological streams again. We were able to look at the shift in terms of history and context over time again. We were also able to see the connection between the publication, theological training at UWC as part of a bigger project of apartheid on the one hand, but we also saw it and started seeing it afresh. You know, theologians and theology students, we weren't standing on our own, but we were part of a collective. And so 60 years of the university's experience becomes almost 60 years of our experience. And we could almost again begin to see the connection between soft subjugation and hard oppression. We could see once again the reality of racial classification, in detailed form, and the way in which it separated people. But the book was also, writing the book was fun. I mean, yeah, it was good to just listen to stories and hear the voices of colleagues and think about those that have gone before us. And and read the poetry. More of that will come as we continue to discuss, but it was one hell of a project. It was nerve-wracking. It was, I think a lot of the Dominees lost all of their theology and spirituality while we were writing this thing, but it was absolutely great fun. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. It's really, really heartening, you know, to hear that. I mean, the both of you, you were in the faculty at different times or during different decades, essentially, but that there's still this entrenched feeling of having gone through something together through your experiences, etc., while having studied there at a very critical time, of course, in the country's history. Ladies and gentlemen, on your screen, you will see the front and back cover of the anthology, Tokkies, Reflections on Solidarity. It is the book we are launching here today. And we will now commence a short discussion about what this anthology entails and the key themes it reflects on. Now, Derrick, the significant act of a small church in the form of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church in a big playing field of societal contestation, a word you coined, against apartheid in the 70s and 80s, propelled everyone who drew at the short end of the straw at the time. In many, if not most cases, this action brought about a profound need to fight for liberation among theology students at UWC. Can you tell us a bit more about how this anthology works to illustrate the inroads made in the struggle for liberation by the Dutch Reformed Mission Church and the students who emerged from the Faculty of Theology at UWC?
Okay, so the anthology is, on the one hand, about theologians that were trained and prepared to go into the ministry of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church. It has, over time, it's become part of an amalgamation, and so is the Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa. So the anthology is partly about that. It starts there, but the anthology is also about stories and voices of people in the 90s that were part of a much bigger project. So when we start off and we talk about the theological training at UWC in 1961, although the plug would say 1965, because that is when the buildings were erected, but they came over in 1961. When we start that discussion, it is a discussion based on a decision made by the Dutch Reformed Synod and the NG Kerk Synod, or the Dutch Reformed Church Synod, which is really a distinction between the White Afrikaner Church and the Colored Church, deciding to move the faculty to the theology of, to University of the Western Cape. That, in a sense, ends somewhere in the mid-80s, early 90s, and so Mariette has an experience not only about the theology faculty, but the theology faculty of religion, a faculty of religion and theology. Yeah. So that's just by way of background that I think it's important that we make that distinctions and know that there were different eras as well. The second thing about the book is that we have 7 chapters, and so in a sense the book starts off with the origins, where it starts and how it evolves and so on. A very exciting piece, also a very serious piece. It then goes on to talk about, talks about the reflections on liberation. And so there's a lot of voices there about people's involvement and so on. And then it goes on to personal journeys, and that's nice because it really touches on how Mariette met Kobus and how Kobus met Mariette and how they got engaged and got married and they both became Dominees and a lot of other little stories like that.
They both happen to be from Saron, though. So, you know, I suppose that helped.
Not at all.
Oh, okay.
But it's then also, some of the stories are about people that passed on. And so we're writing about them. Cyril Africa, we write about. His wife writes about him. Richard Joseph, Andeline writes about Richard. We talk about Reggie Jacobus and Russell Botman, two people that finished their studies at the same time. Reggie, at the end of his life, is a farmer. Russell, at the end of his life, is the rector of the University of Stellenbosch. I mean, both of them started off as training at UWC, at the theology faculty. It's amazing stories. The young man, Albert Loft, that also passed on now, writes about his dad, Chris Loft, the first historian, and he speaks to his dad in this little piece that he writes, and then he talks about his dad at the same time. It's just marvelous to begin to hear those voices coming out. So it is about them that passed on. We talk about Mary-Anne Plaatjies, to which the book is dedicated, because Mary-Anne was part of the team that was thinking through the writing of the book as well, and would have been part of our editorial team and probably been part of this discussion as well. And so I think in many ways she is a representation of an alternative voice also. And so we dedicated the book to her. And then it is about theological reflections. It is about the bridge between UWC, Stellenbosch, and UWC. And then we look at the way forward. Now, that bridge between UWC and Stellenbosch is a very critical one, because on the one hand, here that distinction comes in again. On the one hand, the theology faculty, as it represents the NG Sendingkerk or VGK, that moves to Stellenbosch. But the theology faculty is reduced to a department in the arts faculty at UWC. So in a sense, it splits up as well. So that 6th chapter is a very interesting one with very personal voices there. And then the last one is a beautiful closing chapter of people talking about how do we look at the way forward, how do we experience our past as well. So yeah, it's something like it.
Lovely synopsis, thank you. You touched on the person that this anthology is dedicated to. That's Mary-Anne Plaatjies van Huffel. And my next question I want to direct to you, Mariette. The anthology, was a brainchild of Mary-Anne's, essentially, and she passed away earlier this year. And that's a very significant part of the story of how this book came about. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the initial discussions on what she envisaged for this publication.
Florence, let me take you a few steps back, because initially the idea came from this man next to me, him and his friend Daniel Case. They had a discussion actually about UWC's 160th celebrations and how the former Faculty of Theology and Religion can be part of it. So in that discussions, they then later on spoke to Prof. Dan Kloete, who on his side again in his book, and I want to give the name Vrede Vloei soos 'n rivier, spoke about this Faculty of Liberation, and he journeyed through that book, and that two discussions then came together, and they decided, but we have to approach the university and maybe put something on paper or at least be part of the celebrations. And the initial plan was to have the unveiling of the plaque, which we did on the 24th of September, and then a communal service in the hall, the big hall of UWC. But then COVID came and it couldn't materialize, and then the discussions went further, and actually Prof suggested that his book can't be the last of these conversations. And then in this whole talk about Prof's book and the opening ceremony or unveiling of his book, they decided that maybe we must start or do some kind of publications and go back to back on our journey as part of as Tokkies, as we were called. And so this whole thing started. Mary-Anne obviously came on board as part of the discussions. She was supposed to be the chief editor with then Nico Botha alongside, and then she passed sadly in May this year. So that was said. But actually at the end of the day, this remarkable person next to me decided it can't stay there. Yes. Let me rather get a team together, and then him and Nico contacted us through various discussions with all alumni at UWC, or most of them, and then the team were born, and that is how we started to be approached. The Tokkies asked them to make contributions, and people came with their stories. In the beginning, it was actually, I felt a bit bad for Derrick, because it was a struggle, and you know, Tokkies can be difficult people, very difficult people. So everyone had their point that they want to make, their piece to put there in the discussion. But at the end of the day, we came together. We received all the contributions, and that is why we are here today. So,
So if you had to think back to Mary-Anne having been part of those initial discussions, and us having finalized this publication, what do you think her thoughts would be on what we've produced?
I think she would have been proud. Because remember, she was the one she was the mother figure amongst us. Always trying to be, yes, that voice of reason. She would have felt really, really proud. Yeah.
No, and I think she also would have relished the fact that these stories are finally being told in this way, because I think that was also one of her, objectives, with getting an anthology of this nature out there and published.
And then you can also see it in the book.
You can
a lot of contributions.
Because some of her work is very, not only her own work, because there are some pieces in the book that was written by her. But some of the other people, for example, Dr. Philander, she was his supervisor, and his work is also incredibly telling of, the pursuit of knowledge in this respect. And so, you get a sense that her hand is all over it, which is wonderful. Mariette, I just want to quickly, change lanes, not so much, but in a similar vein, and ask you a question. Mary-Anne herself was the first woman to be ordained as a minister in the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, or the Dutch Reformed family. And you, of course, having followed in her footsteps a few years later. In the anthology, there are references to a few women who affected your views on female leadership in the church. Can you expand a little bit about that and tell us a bit about your own journey as a woman in the Dutch Reformed family, and the path towards what you term in your piece transformational leadership?
Yes, Mary-Anne was the first woman ordained in the church, but prior to her there was Margaret Kaiser, but she was never ordained in the church. Actually, she never became part of the church because of the woman thing. But then there was also Glenda Fredericks. Maybe I might just mention it. She was the first woman who became the chaplain in the Department of Correctional Services. And we used Mary-Anne as the example of things that can be done in the church as reverends. And then myself and Leanne Simon. You remember Prof. Simon, who was part of the panel, his wife. So that is also a Faculty of Theology love story. because ours
I
walk like
believe so,
that.
yes.
But this is what the first ladies, who becomes first in many things. I became the first woman ordained in the by that time Transvaal Synod, the Northern Transvaal Synod. So we followed in the footsteps of Mary-Anne, also using her example of showing that as a leader, we need to be or play a transformative role and not look at the gender roles, or specifically in our church at that time, we didn't have much leverage in the church. We didn't have a strong voice. I don't want to say something about today's. We are many, or let me put it that way, we are many ladies today that is in the ministry or are in the ministry, but at the end of the day, there's still that same struggle going on. So being a reverend in the Uniting Reformed Church, which I can also say is something that I was part of, because in the 90s, the two churches united. The former Dutch Reformed Church with the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa. So I was also part of that transformation in the church. So all these things and being groomed at UWC really helped us to step up our game as women in the church and to make our voice heard even amongst all the voices going on in that time. So it is a remarkable journey. I went to the South African, in the chaplaincy in the South African Defence Force, which was also something unspoken for a woman, doing all this funny stuff with the soldiers. So that is for me the role of transformation, that you can just, being a woman, also do your ministry and make a mark and be significant in what you do, and people not seeing you as a woman. I remember one soldier made a remark. I was in what they called civilian clothes, or civis in the military terms. One day we had a function, and one of the guys said, "Wow, I forgot chaplain is a female." And that is just for me.
Were you wearing a dress?
I was wearing a dress. Okay. Yeah, and they used to seeing me in this camouflage clothes with boots and doing funny stuff with him in the field. So that was the significance of being in the ministry, in the various places or roles that I had to perform in the ministry, but making a mark in terms of change people's perspectives of a woman in ministry and changing people's way of doing and also approaching us as women in the ministry. So that is just a small piece of my journey that I can share.
Very, very insightful. And I think across spheres in society even.
Yes.
But specifically, I think, and more importantly and relevant to this conversation in the church.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Derrick, the contents of this anthology contains reflections of the many alumni who passed through the faculty's doors. Can you talk to us a little bit about the flow of this publication, how it was assembled to represent an accurate reflection of the goings-on at the time? So you did speak earlier a little bit about the chapters, but what was the thinking behind, for example, reflecting firstly on the history of the church itself, and then going into the faculty of theology, how that name changed eventually at the University of the Western Cape, and then also from a societal perspective, what was going on, what was the background to what was going on at the time when you were students?
I think on the one hand, the actual anthology is an impressionistic volume. It's impressions of what happened. It's not complete stories. So, for example, just To give you a quick example, when we have a trial sermon, it is one trial sermon of 318 different trial sermons, but it's an impression of what people do. When we include the article of Mary-Anne doing the inauguration sermon of one of the colleagues, it is an impression of what happens, when people are inaugurated into the ministry. When we start with chapter 1, it is, I think there's so much more to say, but Nati Philander does an excellent piece of work, although it's in Afrikaans, but it takes us through a historical journey of the theological faculty from 1928 all the way through, right? And then it brings us into the 1960s, and it takes us through that journey as well. So it is an anthology that essentially captures the impressions of what happened over a long period of time. Its context is the University of the Western Cape. Its experience is located within a South African experience. So when we talk about 1960 all the way through to 1972, it is an experience of extreme subjugation. We have different bush colleges across the country. So you have a bush college for colored classified people. You have a bush college for Indians up in KwaZulu-Natal, now KwaZulu-Natal. You have a few bush colleges for Black Africans. And in one conversation where Professor Simon talks about his desire to come to the University of the Western Cape was to really break out of that mold of a Black African bush college and become part of something bigger, So that first 10 odd years is really apartheid thriving at its best, and voices really being subjugated and silenced. And then in 73, UWC, they take off their ties and they burn their ties, and the theology department becomes the theology faculty. And you have strange things happening, people burning their ties, to loer wat hulle tasse brand, en to loer wat vir die docent, voor die bors van die docent staan. But it's amazing experiences that is reflective of the time.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? 76 comes, and then we have Alan Busa coming back into South Africa. But the ideological framework of resistance at the time was Black consciousness. Alan comes back, and he then introduces Black theology as within the context of a confessional church, and speaks to James Cone. And it's an amazing piece of work, and it's located within a theological framework trying to explain what is ideologically playing itself out. At the same time, we have the Beleidende Kring, the confessing circle, and it emerges as an amazing voice of small Black churches that is saying, we will stand here and nobody will move us. It's the words of Martin Luther in 1521. It's those words. It says, ons gaan hier staan en niemand gaan ons beweeg nie, want ons staan by die waarheid. That's the Beleidende Kring. And so the Beleidende Kring begins to journey and introduces a voice not only of logic and reason, but the voice of resistance, right? That voice of resistance is located on the campus. I mean, 76, the campus is in Reppenroe. 79, the campus is in Reppenroe. 1980, the campus is Demeka, and theologians and theology students, together with the campus, the university itself, emerges as a site of struggle. And so when you ask me, talk to us about the anthology, then I say to you, our anthology is rooted in our experience, our everyday experience. I mean, people like Nico Koopman, that is now the Vice-Chancellor of the Vice-Chancellor?
He's the Vice-Rector.
Vice-Rector of University of Stellenbosch, comes from a little place called, I don't know where.
In Northern Cape.
Somewhere in the Northern Cape. And Nico is exposed to the radicalness. And I mean, you listen to Nico telling the stories of how he was elevated from a laitiki sitting and doing Hebrew in his room, to a guy that is part of walking and marching and so on. It's an experience that is not only located in the faculty, but it's something that is so much bigger and so much broader. and it's located in our experience. So we come from small rural areas. We come from the city. We come from Joburg. We come from Durban. We meet there. It's a contestation. It's a meeting place of people. And then we leave that space and we go to the rest of the country. And then Alan is busy preaching in the Kapel, the little chapel. And Alan,
on the campus.
On campus.
Yes, I remember you couldn't find enough chairs.
You couldn't find enough chairs. And here Alan is preaching, but he's not preaching to a couple of theology students. He's preaching to an entire campus. Anglicans are there, Catholics are there, Dutch Reform is there, every blessed denomination, and I'm almost convinced every bloody religion was present at the time.
I believe that every religion, there were many representatives from other religions who attended those talks.
Those services, so if you ask me again, what is this anthology? This anthology is an incomplete story of a lot of voices, but beautiful voices, that simply wants to capture moments of a much bigger story. So Eugene, that is part of our editorial, Eugene Bucas, as part of our editorial team, sent me a message this morning. Our next book is. Simply because the book is incomplete. And so if somebody says, I'm going to read Origins, and then I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to read that, and I'm going to get all the names, you're not going to find it there. But if you go to the book and you see the memory walls, and you have one memory wall that captures all the dominies that were trained there. And you get another memory wall of almost 1,000 names of people that just passed through the faculty. And you get a picture collage of pictures of different faces and different events. And you listen or read the poetry, almost listen to those voices coming through. And you read the little snippets of, tales that are being told. Then you say, this is the anthology. And the thrust of this anthology is to remember, is to be reminded. It is to tell us that we have made a significant contribution. We were taught and trained at a significant place, and we were located within a space that is called the University of the Western Cape. What was established as a little bush college, because we shouldn't have been part of the white establishment to train our people, became a force of resistance and linked up with different other institutions. All bush colleges became a formidable force within the movement for liberation.
Just carrying on, with that thought, specifically about where you were sociopolitically. In one of the stories in the anthology, a contributor writes, the state of emergency in 1985 was a harrowing time for all of us on the Cape Flats. And with Jesus Christ as a revolutionary example, just there, reminding us again who the people are who are contributing to this book, what your background is. The Dutch Reformed Missionary Church could not remain silent any longer. It was a dangerous time, especially at the Faculty of Theology, where freedom now was more than a mere slogan. The time for pie in the sky religion was over. Elaborate just a little bit on how the state of emergency catapulted all of you into the political fray at the time. I want to know what it was, besides for Alan Bussack coming onto campus, preaching, etc. What were the influences at the time on campus, outside of campus, your families, your lecturers, in and amongst yourselves? In the book you'll read how often you spoke to one another. They were very strong student activist leaders. We'll get to that in a moment, on campus and in your midst. So it almost seems as if there was there's a theory called crowd theory, but it's more than one individual had an influence on the overall effect of what this movement that you just described. So what were the influences, and how did that, catapult you into what was happening outside of the institution?
If I'll give you the long-winded answer, then I'm going to say 1968 liberation theology emerged across the world. In 1976, and there in that vicinity, black theology as it gets its expression in South Africa emerges. And so that's two very important theological threads. Key to that theological thread is the following: Jesus is Lord. Now, do you want me to preach now? I'm not going to preach, but simply to say that when we read Jesus in the past and we say Jesus is Lord, we almost disassociated ourselves from the context and our reality. When we say Jesus is Lord in the context that we are operating in now, and we're talking post-76 through to 85, and I'm coming there now, then we say this Jesus that stood on the side of the poor and the oppressed and the woman and the outcast, that is the Jesus that we believe in and that we serve. He is Lord and He is Christ. And so when we say we're standing on this side, and here we stand and we will not be moved, Martin Luther, then we're saying Jesus is Lord. Not the church, not the party, not the government, nobody else. Jesus is Lord. Now you come to 1985. 1985 is one of the most scariest of times. Every organization in this country, every organization is banned. We had UDF now, no? It's banned. We had all these NGOs, they are banned. We had all the other movements that were taking place, they are banned. And then the church comes and the church says, Jesus is Lord. And how do they say it? They say it, one, the Kairos document. And so 100 ministers from across all denominations and traditions come and say, we are signing a document that says, here we stand. And everything else is condemned, and we will not accept that. Jesus is Lord. That document becomes a document that filters through into every blessed congregation that you can find in whatever way you find it. And that document says to everybody, you will stand up and you will rise up and you will give protection and you'll cover and you'll march and you'll do all of these things because we believe in Jesus that is Lord. That document and many other movements, including our faculty, then becomes an expression of all the activities on campus. And we don't have to stand and say Jesus is Lord. Our presence there is saying we are witnessing to the truth. We are not witnessing to the lie. So 1985 is a pivotal year in the life of our country. It's an absolutely mind-boggling, changing year. It is the year, by the way, when there are secret talks between South Africans and the ANC in exile. It is the year when you start what they then call IDASA, Institute for an Alternative Democracy in South Africa. And people from Stellenbosch and our own rector at the time, Jake Scherwell and them, they were all part of the delegations that started those underground discussions. It's an amazing year. While everybody else was being beaten to pulps, there was conversations taking place, and in between the church was standing. Now, a little story about Cyril Africa, for example. Cyril Africa in 1985, we have the Trojan Horse Massacre.
Yes,
right? In Athlone, in Thornton Road. And Cyril Africa is in the middle of that Trojan. Cyril is a theologian of note. He passed away at the age of 47. He's a theologian of note. He dies a bit much later. He becomes a minister eventually, but he has to go to jail for 2 years. And so we never read of Cyril. We never know of the things that he's doing, but he's an absolute powerful mover and shaker in the overall conversation of liberation. So when you ask the question, what happened in 1985? The little churches, the voiceless people, the small people, the unknown people, all of a sudden emerged. And they didn't emerge in masses, in marches only. They emerged in the different little activities that had to take place in different spaces. And that is why I say the power of the Spirit was an absolutely amazing power. And we locate some of those stories within the anthology itself. Yeah.
That's absolutely brilliant. That you could do so much, even as an individual, in your community. Small acts. Small acts.
Solidarity. Yeah.
Mariette, the book reflects on many student activists. We just spoke a little bit about what was happening on campus at the time, and so many students specifically were involved, many of them detained. In fact, I think there's a story about one of your fellow students who was detained the day before his trial sermon.
Yes. Speaker Geldenbloem.
Yeah. Some of the students, you know, the late Russell Botman, of course, being one of them, Peter Geldenbloem, Leonardo Appies comes up, etc. What was it about that time and the understanding of the close relationship between theology and the political context of the country that led to the emergence of such strong student leaders? There's a reflection, for example, on how many of the student activists on campus decided to join the workers, I think it was in Belleville, who were leading a strike. You became involved in you know, socio-political activities, once again, outside the campus. I think the campus itself served as a locus in preparation. But can you tell me, or just reflect a little bit on the student activists? Some of them have passed away,
Yes.
you know, and what their role was at the time.
Yeah. For me, actually, you asked the wrong person, because he can give you first-hand information. But what I read while we were busy with the book, the stories, and also interacting with some of the reverends of that time, it's just a story that you can, it's like you are in a movie, the things they did at that time as part of the liberation. And it's illustrated for me wonderfully in the book. It says, these legends, because I don't call them heroes, they are legends, understood and acted out and lived out the prophetic task in South Africa up to 1990s, when I came into play. Remember, I was only born in 1972. But they came in with the small contributions that they made to pluck up and to pull down the unjust apartheid, to destroy its architecture, and to overthrow its champions in positions of power and authority, whilst advocating justice and peace in the church and society. But what is remarkable for me, and where I feel fortunate, Russell Botman was one of my lecturers at the time, so I got a piece of him in my forming years as theologian. South Africa was a friend. Yeah, in my ministry, I met him, and just before he died, for a few years. So, yeah, and he was a remarkable person, very humble, but someone who fights for equality and justice, and made a change in the contributions that he made. James Bass, another person that, you know, our church lost such great people, not just for what they stood for, but also for who they were, just as individuals. All of them very humble. That is the one thing, and that is for me one of the characteristics of Jesus. Never wanted to be on the forefront for own gain, but they were there and they fought all the fights for the poor. And those who were marginalized. And Peter, as you mentioned, him losing out on his trial sermon, which is a very important event in the life of a Tokkie. And he was detained. But yet again, he was absolutely fine with it, because he knew what he stood for at that time. So remarkable people, and there's so many others that we don't even mention in the book, but that people then will recall when they read the book, but say, my father, my friend, my uncle, my nephew. They were part of the struggle, although their stories are not told. But for me, and I think this is maybe where I must stop, is it's not just them on the forefront that who were actually taking part in the marches and being in front and doing the stuff, but it's also those leaders, Tokkies, behind them and who prepare the way for them. That is for me the legends that no one's talk about, because they were the ones doing, soos ons sê, die vuilwerk.
The hard
you know,
grafting.
yes. And then all the gatherings in the chapel, the kapel.
Yeah.
Because that is where things happened. And that is where leaders were formed and leadership in various phases start to develop. And that is the things that happen at the Faculty of Theology. Remember, by the time I got there, I just got stories and pieces of what transpired there, most of them through the eyes of my husband and the friends like Derrick at the time. But that is where we, as the 90s students, were motivated, because we had a new role to play. We were in this time where everything had to change, and we had to take what they left behind, that legacy and what they did already, and we had to build on that to change things in society. And then lastly, the role that they played in church, but also in society, because it didn't end at UWC. Actually, that was the beginning for a lot of them. They went into the congregations, various positions, and they made that change happen, like Russell Botma. And they died for it, like Cyril Africa. The things in that small town that he was ministering in, that was his only congregation, it's still there. His legacy is still continuing. You know, his children can go back, his grandchildren can go back and say, but although we didn't know him, because remember, his children were very small when he died. But at the end of the day, the legacy that he left behind, so they can even just continue with that. So for the new generation, this book is a must to read, because they have a lot of things that they don't know what happened and transpired at UWC. That can help them in this journey, because there's a lot of things in terms of our democracy, but the old apartheid things are still prevailing, and it's still there. So we still have a role to play. Whether you are a new theologian, whether you are just a member of society. So this book will actually be a reflection on what more the church need to do to change the social economic dispensation that is going. It's just worsening instead of improving. So, yeah.
Very insightful. It's a handy guide. I just want to make a general comment before we move on to some more questions. In the foreword, and I believe, Derrick, you wrote it, you described the dissolution of the Faculty of Religion and Theology as happening unceremoniously. And you say, and I quote, "Theological training for ministers of the Uniting Reformed Church of South Africa moved to Stellenbosch University, and religion and theology became a department at UWC. Many people's lives were deeply touched with the closing of the faculty, and like many say, when decisions of enormous proportions are made, only history can judge whether the decision was correct or not." I'd like for a moment for us to reflect on this event, the closing of the faculty. It happened just over 20 years ago, and it is my view that the work of the Faculty of Theology laid the foundation for an integrated kind of spirituality, which is unlike anything we've ever witnessed in South Africa. And you gave a very moving, rendition of what that actually entailed. The existence of this faculty itself, through understanding Black theology and liberation theology, which are, key frameworks that emerged, was the catalyst for a series of events which helped practicing reverends and theologians today understand the multifacetedness of religion. In the closing chapter of the book, you talk about the theater of subjugation, and that is always confronted by contestation. You also reflect on the work of the faculty and draw our attention to the reasons why you trained as theologians. I'd like to ask you to read an extract from that piece in the book, because it is a very accurate, incisive reflection on what needs to be done going forward. And it also echoes what you said earlier, Mariette, about this anthology being a guide of sorts for the new generation or the current generation to reflect on what happened in the past by deepening their understanding of the many methodologies and the things that, you know, that was used at a very difficult time in this country's history, and to apply that in a 21st century context, to say, I mean, what are the things you know, plaguing society today? What are the things that people need to be comforted about or need hope for? So, Derrick, if you could just read, you know, the part about acts and counteracts in the theatre of subjugation, I'd be grateful.
Is it here?
I have it. You can.
No, it's bad. I just want to make two quick remarks before I do this, and simply to say, Hegel, an old philosopher, asked the question about God, and he wants to know about the existence of God in a very confusing and difficult time in the history, 17, 18 there, in that around about. And then he comes up with what he talks about, an evolving God. So there is thesis, and then there's antithesis, and then there's synthesis. Mm-hmm. Marx takes that concept and he applies it to the economy. And he talks about thesis, and then there's an antithesis, which is a contestation, and then you get the synthesis. But it's an ongoing, almost event that is playing itself out within the history of humanity and within creation itself. Mm. When I talk about the theatre of subjugation, and that it's always confronted with contestation, I'm saying that there's never a moment when it comes to an end. There is a moment almost of synthesis, but then we go into a new phase of antithesis, and then we need to engage in this contest, and out of that, you know, we get a new emerging reality. Mm. What has happened in our country is that journey. Our primary contest at a certain point was against apartheid. Also against the economic realities, but essentially against this evil of apartheid that divided and subjugated people in an amazingly painful way. That theatre of contest played itself out in the 70s, in the 80s, much earlier already. I mean, prior in the 60s and prior to that, you know, there was an ongoing battle. We know of the Sharpeville massacre. We know of the Langa massacre that was, you know, part of that spaces. But then we get 1994 with all its chaos, and then there is a moment where we almost arrive at a synthesis. Yeah. Now, in that period of contestation, everybody weren't fair players. I mean, it's not as if all blacks now became liberators or became part of the, we can probably mention a number of spies in our midst that was operating and informers and so on, telling stories and so on. And we can also talk about the number of white Afrikaners that was part of the struggle in bone and marrow and were out there. Beyers Nudis, one such person, an amazing man that walked away from the Broederbond, that walked away from Moderator of the NG Kerk, that walked away from all his privileges and that stepped into the space and said, this is where I'm going to stand. You know what I mean? So, and I can go on. There's Nico, what is Nico's name? That's a very wonderful old Afrikaner, and a number of these young Afrikaners were almost mobilized by such people. I'm going to find his surname now. So we have that. Yeah. Now, when I write the concluding paragraph, I really struggle with where we are now in the 21st century, when our country is crippled by corruption, when our country is busy falling apart as a result of the way in which many of those that we thought would be part of the consciousness of an alternative society actually became entrenched in the chaos and the confusion, the corruption, and the suffering and the oppression of our people. And then I talk about that contest, that theater of contest that is ongoing. So I locate the theater of contest, and I didn't write about Hegel and Marx and so on. I didn't think it was necessary at the time, but I share it with you now because I think when we talk about this, we're actually locating it within the natural flow of history and as it plays itself out in all of God's creation. And that contest is a time that we are in now. And so when Mariette talks about the importance of a young person having to read this thing, then it is the importance of them to understand what that contest was when we were part of the contestation of things and what the contest is now, and identifying those key elements that we need to fight against and that we need to stand up against. At our age, we like becoming old Tokkies, you know, so we're going to probably write a little bit more, but it's the young generation that is not going to burn down buildings, but they're going to take up this fantastic, I mean, I'm marveled with the capacity that democracy gives us to challenge just about everything, to work about and to engage the courts and to ensure that the rule of law applies and to actually make it happen. Local communities can move wonders by just taking our people through an election. It's the most amazing thing. You know, there are different spaces that we can enter into. And our field of contest doesn't necessarily have to be the examples that we use of the past. Our field of contest is much more sophisticated, much more nuanced, and much more intricate way of engaging, even at the local community level. I see how a local person can write an email. I see how people connect with one another through WhatsApp. I see how mobilization takes place. We saw what happened in the belt countries up in the north, Egypt and those places. Yeah. And I see it happening here. It's going to happen. It must happen. And we need to utilize it. Our field of contest is ongoing. Our place that we must stand vast, ons moet op die grond staan en sê, hier staan ons gaan nie beweeg word nie, ons staan vir die waarheid. And the University of the Western Cape, I believe, is one of those pillars that can allow us. Over 60 years, they've given us the space to grow and to develop and to explore and to write and to read and to become intellectuals, but not the intellectual that sits somewhere in a high tower, the intellectual that is defined by Gramsci, that speaks about the organic intellectual, the intellectual that mobilizes and is part of the community and part of the masses. That is the university for over 60 years that have stood the test of time. That is the institution that we learned at. That institution has eroded in a sense because it closed down. That institution needs to re-emerge back in the department and the Faculty of Theology at UWC. That institution must re-emerge at the University of Stellenbosch. That institution needs to challenge the lecturers like we challenge the lecturers. That institution needs to ask the questions about the Belydenis from Allah. That institution needs to speak to, what do we talk about black theology in a context of chaos that is reigning now, but it's a different kind of chaos. It is a chaos by people that we have put in power. So how do we deal with them? That institutions need to ask these critical questions, and I believe that the universities and places of higher learning are those places where we actually can explore that. So I haven't read the counteracts of human solidarity, but I have given something of what lies deep here in my heart, and I believe that out there, we actually need to pick up the baton, and others must walk and move on. Yeah.
Okay. No, well, we don't have to read it.
Yeah.
It's fine because that's a wonderful, reflection on what it says. It is the last few paragraphs of the publication, and it is that piece that forms part of the last chapter. Entitled the path forward. So thank you for that. So I would like to thank you both very much for your time today, and I'd like to conclude this discussion quickly, just by reflecting on a few things that we discussed, and also to help us think about what this book, or this anthology rather, is meant to represent in society today, and what it is and what it can mean for the people who purchase it and read it. So I think Tokkies, Reflections on Solidarity, is not only a reflection on a certain time in history. What I've concluded as its copy editor is that it confronts us with the challenges of the past by presenting a call to action, or as some would say, a roadmap to reform. Ben Franklin once said, either write something worth reading or do something worth writing about. And I think the authors and the editorial committee members, two of whom we have here with us today, have brought this book to fruition, and you have done both. What we have here is a reflection that's been put together in a way that restarts the conversation about what it is to experience watershed moments from a theological perspective at a critical time in history, and entrenching the hard work that remains to be done in the 21st century. So let me seize this opportunity to congratulate every contributor to Tokkies, Reflections on Solidarity, as well as the editorial committee, in particular Reverends Derrick and Mariette Franz, but also Reverends Nico Botha, Eugene Birkus, and Andre Busak, who form part of the editorial committee of this stellar publication. I'll conclude by simply saying that I welcome this book's focus on the power of collective action and what it has achieved in the past. It is a powerful lodestar at a critical time in our country's history. Thank you.
Thank you.